In 1907, Lord Curzon was invited by the University of Oxford to give a lecture. He chose to speak on frontiers. "Frontiers," he said, "are the chief anxiety of nearly every foreign office in the civilized world. They are, moreover, the razor's edge, on which hang suspended the modern issues of war or peace, of life or death to nations." In 2012, there is one frontier dispute that trumps all the rest in terms of the world's current security concerns. That is the Durand Line, the notorious frontier between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Some people blame this frontier for all of Afghanistan's current problems, and there are those who go so far as to blame it for all the problems in Pakistan. This is because the core ethnic group of Afghanistan is Pashtun, and the Durand Line cuts the Pashtun nation into two. Historically speaking, where should the frontiers of all the empires of this region be set? During the 19th century, the European powers were beginning to join the perennial struggle for Central Asia. The British Empire and the Russian Empire were expanding into Central Asia. Their jockeying for position became known as the Great Game. The British were still behind the Indus River, but the question of the frontier and the defence of their Indian possessions was very much on their minds. They wanted to make sure that there was as much land as possible between them and their great rivals, the Russians, who already had their designs on Central Asia and even on India. To that end, the British thought they may create a buffer state, Afghanistan. By the 1880s, the Russian advance on Central Asia had reached the river Oxus and Afghanistan itself. By 1893, the British had concluded that formal borders needed to be established between Afghanistan and British India, so that everyone would know where they stood, and the Russian advance could be held off from the British Empire in India. The man sent to negotiate was the Indian Foreign Secretary, Sir Henry Mortimer Durand. He travelled to Afghanistan in October 1893, and it could not have been the most pleasant of missions to conduct. Britain had invaded Afghanistan several times in the past 50 years, and two of the envoys who had been sent to Afghanistan in the 19th century, Sir Alexander Burnes and Sir Louis Cavalieri, had been cut to small pieces in very unpleasant circumstances. Durand was pretty well out on a limb in Kabul, undertaking these very strange negotiations with the Emir of Afghanistan. Durand's main concern was to secure Afghanistan's northern border with Russia. A first settlement had been made in 1885 using the Oxus River, but the boundary had not been taken all the way east into the region of the Pamirs and the Wakhan. Durand was desperate to make sure that this part of the border was absolutely clear, so that the Russians could not sneak down through the Pamir Mountains into northern India. The Emir dangled that card before Durand to get a better deal when the frontier between British India and Afghanistan was negotiated. It is not the case that the British presented a clearly thought-out proposal for a particular line for the frontier and threatened a further invasion if their proposal was not accepted. There was a lot of give and take in the negotiation. The Emir put forward an ambitious boundary proposal. The British suggested a very different frontier line, which would include Waziristan in British India. There was a lot of toing and froing, but ultimately the Afghans agreed that Dur, Swat, Peshawar and Chitral should be British. In return, the Afghans secured some strategic strongpoints, notably Asmar, which gave them access to Nuristan, and various of Afghanistan's eastern regions. Then, at the very last moment, when agreement had been reached that all of Waziristan should be British, Durand, almost as an afterthought, possibly as a concession to allow the Emir to gain a little face, suddenly allowed the Emir to keep the Burmal tract of Waziristan. This was not the best of ideas, since it involved splitting Waziristan and the Pashtun tribal people into two. The line, as demarcated between 1893 and 1896, partitioned the Pashtun nation into two halves. The northwestern part remained united with Afghanistan, while the southern half became part of British India. What assessment can we make of the line? Was it the best achievable in the circumstances? Perhaps so, but it had, in the words of Fraser Tytler, many defects and few advantages. It was, he said, illogical from the point of view of ethnography, strategy, and geography. Louis Dupre, another Afghan scholar, said it was a classic example of an artificial political boundary cutting through a culture area. Afghanistan had a bad reaction to Indian independence. Before Indian independence, in 1947, the Afghans were very eager to try to bring the Pashtun areas back under Afghan dominion of some sort. They wrote to Lord Mountbatten to raise the possibility of the Pashtuns coming under the Afghan wing. The British gave them the brush-off and said the issue should be discussed with the successor authority, Pakistan. In 1949, Pakistan inadvertently attacked Afghanistan territory by air. A skirmish followed. Shortly afterwards, a lawyer Jirga, a great council in Kabul, repudiated all the boundary treaties made with the British, gave support to the idea of an independent Pashtunistan, and urged all the people in those areas should be given a referendum and the right to vote to join Afghanistan. The West did not allow this to happen, yet in the 1980s, after the Soviet invasion, it seemed perfect sense to use the Pashtun tribal areas as a point for launching the Mujahideen into Afghanistan. Again in the 1990s, its isolation made it the perfect place to train the Taliban before they moved to control most of Afghanistan. In 2001, after the fall of the Taliban government in Kabul, the Pashtun area became a refuge for the Taliban loyalists. Afghanistan does not recognise the Durand Line as a legal international boundary. The Afghans claim agreement to the line was attained under duress. At the time of Indian independence, the Pashtuns were not given the option of full self-determination. They were only given the choice between joining India and joining Pakistan, not independence or joining Afghanistan. The line itself generates instability. It is not policeable, and the constitution of the tribal areas does not permit economic development to take place. In the 60 years since independence, Pakistan has not been able to bring these areas under proper administration. They remain a well of instability, which cannot help harming the ultimate interests of both Afghanistan and Pakistan. While President Karzai has called for Pakistan not to interfere beyond the line, he refuses to recognise its validity. Neither he nor any other Afghan politician would wish to surrender the irredentist claims over the Pashtun tribes on the Pakistan side of the line. So deeply are those claims ingrained in Afghan politics and history. The only possible way that progress could be made is for the paramount importance of the problem to be recognised by both the nation-states in the region and by the various global powers with an interest in the stability and development of Afghanistan and Central Asia. It seems that few Western governments, certainly not the British government, have anything even in the way of a Pakistan policy, let alone a broader vision for the wider region involving Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Iran, and the Central Asian states. When Lord Curzon addressed the scholars of Oxford in 1907, he spoke with a magnificent late Victorian self-assurance about the future of the world's frontier zones. It would be futile to assert that an exact science of frontiers has been or is ever likely to be involved, for no one law can possibly apply to all nations or all peoples, to all governments, all territories or all climates. The evolution of frontiers is perhaps an art rather than a science, so plastic and malleable are its forms and manifestations. But the general tendency is forward, not backward. Neither arrogance nor ignorance is any longer supreme. Precedence is given to scientific knowledge. Ethnological and topographical considerations are fairly weighed. Jurisprudence plays an increasing part. The conscience of nations is more and more involved. Thus frontiers, which have so frequently and recently been the cause of war, are capable of being converted into the instruments and evidences of peace. Lord Curzon is right. Afghanistan will never have peace or stability until its borders are redrawn and each of its core ethnic groups have self-determination.